In the lavish dining room of the Golden Plate, Victor Harding sat in his usual seat, the epitome of wealth and arrogance. His gaze flickered over the family seated nearby, a simple man, his wife, and their young son, whom he dismissed with a sneer. But when an innocent mistake shatters the evening's calm, Victor's cruel words set off a chain of events that no amount of money can undo. Little did he know, the family he mocked wasn't just another table of strangers. They were the ones who would change his life forever. If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. The Golden Plate was not just a restaurant. It was an experience. The low hum of conversation blended with the soft clinking of silverware, and the ambient light from the crystal chandelier reflected off the polished surfaces of fine china and glasses of red wine. It was a place where wealth and prestige danced in every corner. In this luxurious setting, the atmosphere felt almost sacred, a place for the city's elite to dine and feel superior. Victor Harding adjusted his silk tie in the reflection of his butter knife, his eyes narrowing as he checked his appearance. Everything had to be perfect. He had worked too hard for too long to let anyone forget it. With a smirk on his face, he sat back in his chair, waiting for his meal to arrive. Another night, another chance to remind the world of his superiority. He raised his hand to signal the waiter, but his attention was soon drawn to the restaurant's entrance. A family of 3 stepped into the Golden Plate. They looked out of place, not because they weren't dressed well, but because their innocence and awe were too genuine for the setting. Henry Thompson, the father, was tall but had the simple appearance of a man who worked hard for a living. His wife, Ella, stood beside him, wearing a soft smile that warmed the room despite the coldness of the surroundings. And then there was Ethan, their young son. His wide eyes gleamed with excitement, unable to hide his joy at finally being in a restaurant like this. Their enthusiasm was almost infectious. As they were led to a nearby table, Victor watched them closely. He could hardly believe that such people would dare to enter a place like this. Well, he muttered under his breath. Looks like they let just about anyone in here these days. Victor leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a moment to savor his superiority. He adjusted his jacket, feeling the cool fabric against his skin, and reached for the menu. He already knew what he would order, the same thing he always did. He wasn't here to try something new after all. He was here to maintain his place at the top. The waiter approached his table, notepad in hand, and greeted him with a polite smile. "Good evening, Mr. Harding. What can I get for you tonight?" Victor barely glanced at the menu, waving his hand dismissively. "The usual," he replied, "and make it quick. I don't have all night to wait around." The waiter nodded and walked off, leaving Victor to his thoughts. His gaze shifted back to the Thompson family, who were sitting at their table with wonder in their eyes. Ethan was the first to speak, his excitement spilling over as he looked at the menu. "What do you think, Dad?" he asked, looking up at Henry with a hopeful expression. "It's my birthday, so can I try the lobster?" Henry smiled warmly at his son. "Of course, son," he said, his voice full of love. "You can have anything you want tonight." Victor rolled his eyes, silently mocking them. Special occasion indeed, he thought to himself. He was willing to bet they couldn't afford lobster on a regular day. They probably lived paycheck to paycheck, just scraping by. As the evening continued, Victor's irritation grew. The Thompson family's laughter, their joyful conversation, grated on his nerves. It was a stark contrast to the cold silence that hung over him at his own table. He was so used to the solitude of his wealth that the sound of others enjoying themselves felt intrusive. When Ethan accidentally knocked over his glass of water, spilling it across the table, Victor saw his opportunity. He didn't even wait for the waiter to come and clean up the mess. He stood up, his voice rising with frustration. "For God's sake," he shouted, "can't you control your child? This is a 5-star establishment, not some fast food joint." The restaurant fell silent. All eyes turned to Victor and then to the family he had just insulted. Henry and Ella sat there, stunned. while Ethan looked as though he might burst into tears at any moment. The tension in the room was palpable. "I'm sorry," Henry said, his voice calm but tight. "It was an accident. We'll clean it up." But Victor wasn't satisfied. He sneered. "You'll do more than that. You'll remove yourselves from this restaurant before you embarrass yourselves further. People like you don't belong in a place like this." Ella stood up, her face flushed with anger. "What exactly do you mean by people like us?" she demanded, her voice steady but fierce. Victor waved his hand dismissively, a smirk playing on his lips. "Look around," he said, sweeping his arm to gesture at the other diners. "Do you see anyone else here who looks like you? This isn't the kind of place that caters to your sort." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Several patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others openly glared at Victor, but he was too caught up in his own self-righteousness to notice. He continued, his voice rising. "I've worked hard for my money. I've earned the right to enjoy a meal without having to watch some diversity hire fumble around with silverware he's probably never seen before." At this, Henry stood up, his calm demeanor never wavering. "Sir," he said, his voice measured but firm, "I think you've said quite enough. We came here to celebrate our son's birthday, not to be insulted by a stranger." Victor let out a harsh, mirthless laugh. "Birthday? Well, isn't that precious?" he said, sneering. "Tell me, boy, what did your father get you? A new basketball? Some baggy pants?" That was when the restaurant's manager, James Cole, appeared by Victor's side. His face was flushed with anger, but he remained composed. "Mr. Harding," he said, his voice firm but polite, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We don't tolerate this kind of behavior here." Victor's eyes widened in disbelief. "Leave?" he said, his voice rising with indignation. "Do you know who I am? I could buy and sell this entire establishment 10 times over." But James stood his ground. "Be that as it may, sir," he said calmly. "Your money doesn't give you the right to abuse our other patrons. Now please leave before I'm forced to call security." Fuming, Victor threw his napkin onto the table and stood up, glaring at the Thompson family as he stormed toward the exit. He was furious, humiliated, but his anger was only just beginning to simmer. As he passed the bar, a waiter approached him with a folded piece of paper. "Sir," the waiter said, "this was left for you." Victor snatched the paper from the waiter's hand, unfolded it, and read the words inside. The color drained from his face and his hands began to shake. For the first time that evening, Victor Harding was at a loss for words. Victor Harding's steps were heavy as he stormed out of the Golden Plate. His face burned with anger and his heart pounded in his chest. How dare they treat him like this? How dare they challenge his authority in front of a room full of people? His mind raced with thoughts of revenge, but as he walked toward the exit, something caught his eye. A waiter standing at the bar, holding a folded piece of paper. He snatched the note from the waiter's hand, his fingers trembling as he unfolded it. The words inside sent a shockwave through his entire being, draining the color from his face. He read it again, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "Dear Mr. Harding, we hope you enjoyed your meal at the Golden Plate. We are always grateful when the owners of our restaurant take the time to dine with us. Sincerely, Michael and Clara Weston, owners of Weston Enterprises." Victor's heart stopped. The family he had just insulted, the family he had dismissed as beneath him, owned the very restaurant he had just been dining in. He stared at the note, his fingers gripping it tightly as if it could offer him some explanation. His eyes darted to the family, still seated at their table. But now, they weren't just any family. They were the owners of the restaurant, the very place where he had tried to assert his superiority. Victor's mind was racing, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. He turned back to look at the Thompsons, who were now being comforted by other diners. Henry was speaking quietly to his son, his face still tense but composed. Ella was trying to calm Ethan, who still looked shaken by the entire ordeal. Michael Weston's calm voice cut through Victor's thoughts. "Mr. Harding," he called, his tone carrying across the now silent restaurant. Why don't you join us for dessert? I think we have a lot to talk about. The words struck Victor like a slap to the face. Join them? After everything he had just said? After publicly humiliating them? Victor felt a mix of disbelief and shame flooding through him. He couldn't just walk away now. He had to face the consequences of his actions, but the question was, how would he face them? He stood frozen in place for a moment, staring at Michael, who met his gaze with a calm, almost challenging look. Beside him, Clara Weston stood with her arm around Ethan, the boy still looking at Victor with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Sarah Weston stood nearby, watching him closely, but there was no anger in her expression. Just an invitation, an open hand. Victor's mind was in turmoil. Every instinct told him to leave, to storm out and never look back. But something about Michael's invitation stirred something inside him. It was a challenge, one he didn't fully understand but couldn't refuse. The room was still. The tension hung thick in the air, but Victor felt strangely compelled to move forward. His steps were hesitant at first, almost as if he was being drawn toward them by an invisible force. He walked slowly, his hand still clutching the crumpled note. Each step felt like an eternity, but he couldn't turn back now. The truth had already been laid out before him, and he had no choice but to face it. When he reached the Weston family's table, the eyes of the entire restaurant followed him. The murmurs of conversation had stopped, and the room was filled with a strange silence. Michael motioned for him to sit, his expression calm, but unreadable. "Please," Michael said, his voice low and steady. "Take a seat." Victor hesitated, for a moment, then slowly sat down, his posture rigid. His mind was racing, his usual confidence completely absent. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he had never felt before. He couldn't remember the last time he had been made to feel so small. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension between them was thick, the weight of the situation pressing down on Victor's chest. Then Michael leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his gaze locked onto Victor's. "What don't you understand, Mr. Harding?" Michael asked, his voice calm but firm. "Do you not understand that the people you just insulted own this restaurant? Or that your assumptions about us were completely off base?" Victor opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? How could he justify his behavior? He had been blinded by his own arrogance, and now he was faced with the reality of his actions. He glanced around the table, his eyes meeting Clara's, then Ethan's. The boy looked at him with wide eyes, his innocent curiosity cutting through the tension like a knife. Victor started, but his voice trailed off. He had no excuses, no defense. All he could do was sit there, stunned by the realization of how wrong he had been. Sarah Weston, who had been silent up until now, spoke up, her voice sharp but not unkind. "You assumed that we were beneath you because of the way we looked. You assumed that we didn't belong in a place like this." Her words hit Victor like a slap, but they were true. He had made those assumptions without ever questioning them. Victor's face flushed with shame. He opened his mouth again, but the words wouldn't come. He felt like he was sinking into the floor, as if he couldn't escape the weight of his own guilt. "I'm sorry," he finally managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. "I had no idea." Clara Weston's voice interrupted him, gentle but firm. "That's the problem, Mr. Harding. You never took the time to understand. You never asked. You just assumed." Victor nodded slowly, his head hanging low. The weight of their words, their disappointment, crushed him. He had spent so long in his own world, in his own bubble of privilege, that he had never stopped to think about the experiences of others. He had never questioned his own biases or the assumptions he had made about people who didn't look like him. Ethan, still sitting quietly at the table, looked up at Victor with wide eyes. "Are you scared of us, mister?" he asked, his voice innocent and curious. Victor's heart sank. The boy's question cut through the tension in the room like a knife. He had been so quick to judge them, to dismiss them as other, but now for the first time he saw them for who they truly were. A family, just like his own. And that realization hit him harder than anything else. "I don't know," Victor said quietly, his voice breaking. I've never really thought about it before. Michael Weston leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. Sometimes, Mr. Harding, people carry anger and fear inside them, and sometimes that fear makes them say and do hurtful things. Victor looked up at Michael, feeling the weight of his words. He had been blind to the truth for so long, but now he was beginning to see it. His assumptions, his prejudices, had all been rooted in fear. Fear of what he didn't understand, fear of what he couldn't control. For the first time in his life, Victor felt vulnerable. He felt exposed, but it was in this moment of vulnerability that he realized something. He had a choice. He could continue down the path of arrogance and pride, or he could choose to learn, to grow, to be better. The choice was his, but for the first time, he wasn't sure which path to take. The room was heavy with silence. Victor Harding sat at the table, his mind racing, his heart still pounding in his chest. The weight of his previous actions pressed down on him. He couldn't recall the last time he had felt so small, so utterly out of control. As he sat there trying to process everything that had happened, the soft clink of silverware and the murmurs of other diners seemed distant. All he could focus on were the faces of the Weston family, Michael, Clara, and Ethan, staring at him with a mixture of curiosity, disappointment, and an odd sense of patience. Victor had always prided himself on his ability to control every situation, to assert dominance, and to always be the one in charge. But in the face of the Westons, all that control felt like an illusion. His usual arrogance seemed to have abandoned him, leaving behind a man unsure of who he really was. Michael Weston leaned forward slightly, his expression calm but intense. Mr. Harding, he began, his voice steady. This is about more than just tonight. It's about how you've treated others your whole life. Your assumptions, your judgments, they've all been based on something shallow. Victor swallowed hard. The words stung, but they were true. He had spent so much of his life in a bubble, surrounded by people who looked and thought like him. He had never considered that there were people out there who lived lives very different from his own. People who deserved the same respect and kindness he expected from others. He had been blind to the struggles of others, blinded by his own privilege. I never realized, Victor muttered, his voice barely audible. I never stopped to think about it, I guess. Michael gave him a small nod, as if to acknowledge the sincerity in Victor's voice. It's easy to miss, Mr. Harding. We all have blind spots. But the real question is what you're going to do with what you've learned. Victor didn't have an answer. He felt trapped, caught between the man he had been and the man he was beginning to understand he could become. But before he could respond, the sound of soft footsteps approaching interrupted the moment. A waiter carrying a small folded piece of paper appeared beside their table. He paused, looking directly at Victor. Mr. Harding, he said, this was left for you at the bar. Victor looked at the waiter in confusion. A note? At this moment? He reached for the paper without thinking, unfolding it roughly. His eyes skimmed over the words, and with each line, his heart sank further. The paper was simple, just a few lines written in neat handwriting. Dear Mr. Harding, we trust you had a pleasant dinner. We always appreciate when the owners of our favorite restaurants come to visit. We believe every story has its own twist, and sometimes the best lessons come from the most unexpected places. Sincerely, Michael and Clara Weston. Victor's hands shook as he reread the words. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. This wasn't just a note from any customer. It was from the Westons, the very people he had insulted earlier, the people who had every reason to make him feel small and humiliated. But instead of retaliation, they were offering him something else, an opportunity for reflection. As he sat there holding the note, everything in his world seemed to tilt. The Westons, the people he had dismissed as beneath him, had just given him a glimpse of something far more valuable than money or power. They had given him the chance to see himself, to face the ugly truth about who he had been, and more importantly, to choose who he wanted to be moving forward. Victor's gaze shifted from the note to Michael Weston, who was watching him closely. Clara, too, was looking at him with a quiet intensity, as if they were waiting for him to process what had just happened. Victor began, his voice cracking slightly. I don't know what to say. You should hate me right now. Michael gave him a soft smile. Hate is a heavy word, Mr. Harding. We don't need to hate anyone to recognize when they've made a mistake. What matters is that you're willing to learn from it. Victor looked down at the note again, his fingers tracing the edges of the paper. He felt something stirring within him, something unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. For the first time, in a long while, he felt the weight of his own arrogance lifting, replaced by something else. Humility. I've been wrong, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been so wrong. Clara nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. The first step is realizing that, Mr. Harding. The next step is doing something about it. Victor felt the full weight of her words. Doing something about it. How many times had he sat in his office surrounded by his wealth and success, thinking he had all the answers? How many times had he assumed that he knew best, that he had earned the right to look down on others? But now, sitting at this table with people he had wronged, he understood that the real work, the important work, was just beginning. The waiter returned to the table, this time with a tray of desserts, a delicate chocolate cake, rich fruit, tarts, and a variety of pastries that looked almost too beautiful to eat. He set the tray down in front of the Westons and then turned to Victor. Would you care for some dessert, Mr. Harding? He asked, his tone polite but neutral. Victor didn't know how to respond. The offer felt almost too much after everything that had happened. But then he realized something. They weren't offering him dessert as a reward or as some kind of consolation. They were offering it as an invitation, a way of showing him that no matter how far he had fallen, it wasn't too late to change. Yes, Victor said, his voice steadier now. I'd like to join you. As he picked up his fork and took a bite of the chocolate cake, he felt a strange sensation. It wasn't just the taste of the cake that filled him. It was something deeper. It was the first real moment of connection he had felt in years, a moment that transcended wealth and status. And in that moment, Victor Harding understood. This was the beginning of something new. The Westons, who had every right to dismiss him, had given him a second chance, not just to redeem himself in their eyes, but to redeem himself in his own. And he wasn't going to waste it. As the evening wore on, Victor found himself engaged in genuine conversation with the Westons. They spoke of their work, their passions, and the causes they cared about. For the first time, Victor found himself listening, truly listening, instead of waiting for his turn to speak. And as the night came to an end, Victor knew that the note he had just read was more than just words. It was a turning point, the moment that had shifted everything in his life. It was the beginning of his transformation, a chance to rewrite his story, and he was ready to start. The next few days after his encounter with the Weston family were a blur for Victor Harding. The note, the conversation, and the unexpected invitation to join the Westons for dessert had shaken him to his core. He had spent a lifetime building a life based on arrogance, pride, and the belief that success came from asserting his superiority over others. But that night, everything had changed. Victor sat in his office, staring out the large windows of his penthouse suite. His hands rested on the polished wood of his desk, but his mind was miles away. He was no longer the same man who had walked into the golden plate just days before. The person staring back at him in the reflection wasn't the one he had spent years cultivating, but someone different, someone humbled, and for the first time in a long while, hopeful. As he stared into the distance, the words Michael Weston had spoken echoed in his mind. What matters is that you're willing to learn from it. Those words weren't just a challenge. They were a call to action. And Victor realized that he had a choice to make. He could continue on his current path, hiding behind his wealth and the walls he had so carefully built around himself. Or he could embrace the discomfort and work toward real, lasting change. The question lingered in the back of his mind. How could he begin? The answer was both simple and complex. It started with acknowledging his own mistakes, understanding the pain he had caused, and committing to the journey of growth. Victor had always believed that being wealthy and powerful meant he had all the answers, but he had learned that wealth didn't equate to wisdom, and power didn't guarantee respect. It was humbling but liberating at the same time. He had spent so many years thinking his success was about what he had accomplished, what he owned, and how others viewed him. But now he was realizing that true success was about the kind of person you became, not just the titles you held or the material things you acquired. The decision to change wasn't going to be easy. Victor knew that. There would be obstacles along the way, and he was certain there would be moments of doubt. But for the first time, he was ready to face those challenges head-on. He had never truly questioned his own biases before. He had never stopped to listen to the people around him, to truly hear their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs. That was about to change. Victor's first step was to reach out to the Westons. He drafted a simple text to Michael, something that conveyed his gratitude and his desire to continue learning. He hit send, and moments later, Michael's reply came through. "I'm glad to hear from you, Victor. Let's talk more soon." The next few days were a whirlwind of reflection. Victor found himself reading articles about diversity and inclusion, attending webinars, and even enrolling in courses that would help him better understand the experiences of others. He spent time learning about the challenges people from different backgrounds faced, and slowly, he began to see the world through a different lens. The more he learned, the more he realized how much he had taken for granted in his own life. It wasn't just about race or gender. It was about opportunity, access, and perspective. The truth hit him hard. The very things he had once dismissed as not his problem were, in fact, everyone's problem. And now, he had a responsibility to do something about it. As Victor dug deeper into these issues, he began to feel a shift within himself. The old Victor, the man who had been obsessed with appearances and status, began to fade away. He found himself more compassionate, more understanding, and more open to learning from those who had once seemed so different from him. He knew he couldn't change everything overnight, but he was determined to take small steps every day to become a better person, to create a better environment for those around him. Victor's transformation wasn't just about changing his outlook on life. It was about applying that newfound wisdom to his work, to his company, and to his relationships. He called a meeting with his senior executives and presented a new vision for the company, one that emphasized inclusion, empathy, and respect. The board members were skeptical at first, but Victor didn't back down. He shared the lessons he had learned, the realizations he had had about himself, and the changes he wanted to implement. Slowly, they began to understand. It wasn't long before Victor reached out to Michael Weston again, this time asking if he could join the Weston Foundation's initiatives. Michael and Sarah were more than happy to welcome him, and Victor soon found himself involved in the organization's mentorship programs, diversity training sessions, and community outreach efforts. He attended meetings with individuals who were passionate about creating change, and he listened. He listened to the stories, the struggles, and the hopes of others. And he realized just how much he had been missing by living in his isolated bubble. But it wasn't just about what he could give. It was about what he could learn. As the weeks passed, Victor found himself more engaged in the work of the foundation. He helped organize community events, mentored young professionals from underrepresented backgrounds, and began to shape his company's hiring practices to reflect the values of inclusivity he had come to understand. One of the most important lessons Victor learned was the power of vulnerability. Before, he had been too proud to admit his faults, but now he was learning that true strength came from being open, from showing others that it was okay to make mistakes, to learn from them, and to grow. It wasn't easy, but every step forward felt like a victory. As the months passed, Victor's transformation became more apparent. His company, once a place of exclusivity and privilege, began to shift towards something more inclusive and welcoming. Employees, both new and old, started to feel like their voices mattered. and Victor made a point of listening to them. The changes weren't immediate, and there were setbacks along the way, but Victor remained committed to the process. He had learned that real change took time, but it was worth every second. The final piece of the transformation came when Victor returned to the golden plate. This time he was not the arrogant businessman, but a man who had learned humility. He didn't sit at the head of the table demanding respect. Instead, he joined the Westons as equals, grateful for the lessons they had taught him. As the evening drew to a close, Michael Weston leaned over and gave Victor a nod of approval. "You're doing good work, Victor. It's a long road, but you're on the right path." Victor smiled, the weight of his past mistakes no longer holding him back. "I know," he said quietly, "and I'm ready to keep moving forward." For the first time in his life, Victor Harding felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The path ahead was still uncertain, but he had finally learned how to walk it with purpose, humility, and a deep commitment to making the world a better place.